In another attempt to analyze a complex series of response videos, this time I'm just going to simplify everything within a really multi video series to really pull out the main points of disagreement between all the parties involved by either labeling them as the defense or the prosecution. In this case of gamers versus Dead Space versus gamers, but just gamers versus Dead Space Remake. I'll be trying to do this by focusing mainly on the main points of criticism towards, the actual game. To start off with, the prosecution charges the Dead Space Remake with the developers purposely making Nicole's face less attractive. I'm assuming for some sort of political motivation here. The defense counters that with that
It's a poor point to make, mainly due to the fact that Tanya Clark had performed under mocap, so the model was based off of her own looks. So what he is actually saying is that Tanya Clark isn't attractive, which is his opinion, but personally I really wouldn't voice that one.
the prosecution counters with
The main issue with how she looks is that she looks nothing like how Nicole looked in the original. Her new design is on purpose. This has little to do with her voice or her mocapping the character. EA deliberately decided to change Nicole's face to help push certain social narratives in gaming.
It seems like the defense is simply stating a fact and follows that up with his opinion on the optics, or should I say, just how it will come off to a more general audience of those particular matters. The prosecution doubles down on that without really using any arguments of why they believe that to be the truth in this particular game, because they've seen it done in other games that aren't the Dead Space remake. But there are examples put out there that one could make the connection to, but the prosecution simply does not make the connection for that audience. Now, even if that is the truth in these other games that the prosecution lays out there,
It's comical you say a company like EA would care less about faces to spin a political or social narrative.
the defense never said any of that. If you want people to believe that he's even implying that, you need to make a better connection between those 2 points and really not put words in the defense's mouth here.
Ever saw Mass Effect Andromeda? What about Battlefield 5? How about Apex Legends? You believe they won't spin a political or social narrative? Then why did EA Sports UFC 3's main menu receive a makeover in the form of a section dedicated to Black Lives Matter?
Wasn't the original claim that at least the defense was sort of addressing about the developers doing this, not the publishers? Because this sounds a lot like the prosecution.
Play dumb, move goalpost.
That's at least what the defense is responding to, given
Ask? Well, it's really just based on a misunderstanding. See, in Reborn's comment section, he had made a point about the developers purposely making Nicole's face less attractive.
Now, I can't be sure that's what actually is said. The prosecution sort of dismissed this as none of this actually mattering.
Give a rat's ass if it was a misunderstanding, and I don't really care how I got involved at this point.
Besides that, the prosecution is assuming that EA, just as the publisher, is pushing these issues instead of just perhaps following the social trends that already exist in society, with things like every company sort of changing their logo to the rainbow thing, at least in America, with Pride Month, and the massive amount of support BLM got after the death of George Floyd. But before it got found out, the founders of BLM enriched themselves, friends and family before, resigning from the org. But that's a completely different matter. Foresight is 2020. Moving on, the prosecution charges the Dead Space remake with
Authentic Man once again is right. There is subliminal messages in the Dead Space Remake, but if you want examples of subliminal messages in Dead Space Remake, there's the all-gender restrooms, race swapping characters, and race swapping characters on posters and signs from Asian to black within the ship.
The defense counters with,
What does an all-gender bathroom sign say to the player? What is the subliminal message behind it? I ask this because creators such as yourself refuse to answer the simple question.
frankly, I don't even know how the all gender bathrooms are connected to any trans issues or activism. I've really never seen anything about all gender bathrooms being a problem or even a main concern about the bathrooms, which technically is almost exclusively about the biological males, trans women, being allowed into women's bathrooms, locker rooms, at least in theory. That is if, in fact, that this is somehow subliminal propaganda. But let's grant them that. Let's say this is somehow subliminal, supposed to go under the conscious sight or psyche of particular people. Who does this even help? And really, how does it help them in any way? Only groups I can think that would really benefit from this, if it is in fact subliminal propaganda, and somehow EA as the publisher forced this choice on the developer. The only group that I think that could benefit from this choice might be those who want to abolish the idea of gender as a whole, because it really doesn't play greatly into the trans issues that are occurring right now in the real world. And that is if, in fact, the developer or EA are trying to insert some form of subliminal propaganda into the game, which I don't think can be established properly because it's rather noticeable about that choice. It's not an example of something that would really go under the radar because, frankly, people pointed it out, and even then, this would be really bad propaganda given the context of the actual video game. Think about it. The cult in control of the spaceship doesn't think gender is a real thing and it should be abolished. The cult also has been playing with an unknown artifact that could, destroy all of humanity if it managed to spread. So I don't think this so-called subliminal propaganda, given the context of the story, paints whatever identity group it's trying to be a stand-in for or a representation for in the game very favorably.
Race swapping. Okay, let's go through all of the race swaps in the game. There's Johnson, who had been turned into a black woman, and there were the posters, which had been changed. Oh, that's it? A minor character that dies in the first chapter and a set of posters? The anti-woke community really has their work cut out for them this time.
The anti-woke community definitely has their work cut out for them because of imbeciles like you who go hard defending woke shit in media. Apparently, you don't know what a subliminal message is. It's something companies implement in their products that can be done in several different ways. It could be text on walls, a flashing image, a subtle design choice in a character, or a line of dialogue. It is not meant to be directly shoved in your face and explained in detail.
Okay, this almost seems to be very reflective of what I said before about the whole gender bathroom. The more I look at these arguments being made here, the more I think that the anti-woke movement is missing the opportunity to call these things actually racist. Remember, the people running this ship and who put those posters up on those walls caused all the horror that befalls the whole game really to start. And also,
there's Johnson, who had been turned into a black woman, and there were the posters, which had been changed. Oh, that's it? A minor character that dies in the first chapter?
Now, if you wanted to spin this, you could say that EA or the actual developer of the game did this race swap to sort of kill off this particular character if you were of that particular mindset. Now, I could go on, but I'm really not trying to give any of these anti-woke people any more really arguments than I already have. because frankly, I would rather them try to think of any of this themselves.
Plus, Synthetic Man is incorrect on so many levels, and all you have to do is watch the Twitter video of him explaining the conspiracy theory of the replacement theory to sum it all up. Use.
Synthetic Man once again is right. There is subliminal messages in the Dead Space remake. You, a Dead Space dedicated channel, won't point that out.
I hope the prosecution isn't trying to say replacement theory is correct here, because, yeah, even Synthetic Man knows.
Obviously, I have no proof that free or any other groups I probably am not even allowed to say on YouTube are part of BlackRock. I can't prove that to you in any way, but I really don't see any harm in pointing it out. And really, that's why I don't feel bad about saying any outlandish things.
Also, he is at least self-aware enough to say that it is an outlandish thing to say, which sort of lends some credence to the defense's claim here. Not entirely. I mean, not rock solid, but it does place the credibility of Synthetic Man really in serious doubt. And outside of that, there's really little evidence to actually support the replacement theory out there in the world. And trust me, in research for this, I looked far and wide. It just doesn't make sense as it's stated out there from all sides of the spectrum, unless you're incredibly far right, and maybe even there's some far left ideas that sort of go along with his lines. But that's besides the point here. Still,
Or in your case, just ignore and blindly defend at all cost. People point out these subliminal messages because they can easily be missed. That, and there's people like you who fight to keep these subliminal messages intact. And when it comes to the race swapping and all gender restrooms, again, look up ESG to put the pieces together.
in my case, I do not ignore nor blindly defend anything. I just think critically about the media that I analyze, no matter if it's a movie, video game, or YouTube video. And I don't just take people at their word value. Sometimes I'll simply agree with them because they align with my particular preference. Other times when I don't, I'll hear out their claims, listen to their evidence and arguments, and take a lot of things in consideration before I even attempt to formulate an opinion or analysis of something myself. I don't let tribal instinct, team sports, or identity politics really affect what I think about any particular matter on any particular subject. I approach things from a rational perspective that can be put together in my mind. Rationale isn't everything under the sun, but it's definitely a good foundation for building critical thinking upon. And given I said all of that, yeah, I watched all 3 videos the prosecution linked in the description, plus some, what's in my opinion, more credible sources talking about the same subject matter. Here's a recent video that does make that link.
Point is that these investment funds have rules, kind of ethical rules, really, and that gaming companies in particular are attempting to conform to said rules. However, let's go one step further and make it completely obvious. Remember that list of companies that hired Sweet Baby Incorporated that they brag about on their official website? Let's look at those, starting with Electronic Arts. The largest 2 institutional shareholders of EA, BlackRock and Vanguard.
There was also an article that I found while researching all of this that shows there being a push for doing the same thing that Blizzard did after their sexual harassment scandal, at least for a couple different games. But for us who remembers the Blizzard diversity controversy, them using some sort of metric to determine diversity in games, it's very believable that Blizzard was doing this to up their ESG score to secure extra capital to, cover the cost of their sexual harassment scandal and other unknown reasons. Still, given the nature of this article and what was highlighted in the research that Upper Echelon included in his video,
this trend is in line with the hypothesis that after the disclosure event, funds might replace some ESG assets with higher yielding but less sustainable assets, end quote. Simplified, before disclosing what assets they hold, ESG funds are rearranging themselves to look good, only to sell off those assets immediately and invest back into whatever is just most profitable.
Seems like ESG, along with BlackRock and Vanguard, is more using what is seen as woke in a way to play the stock market and control businesses out there. Or maybe a little bit more conspiratorial, maybe a way to generally create chaos among the left and right in most areas of life, more than it really seems to come across as a serious push to actually change culture in any serious way. Sort of like how they use the progressive stack in Occupy Wall Street to sort of disrupt that protest against the one percenters. Frankly, if I'm going out on a limb, that's really the only conclusions I can come to based on the evidence that really is presented to me. This is why I really see such minor changes to a game like Dead Space Remake, depending on your point of view of it. If it's woke or anti-woke, you can really abstract either one from the information within the actual game. Nevertheless, it seems to be missing the general point. And it is possible that, it's feeding into what those in BlackRock and Vanguard are trying to do with, the weaponization of ESG against, people such as Elon Musk.
Or in simpler terms, the biggest factor that goes into ESG is scoring how woke your corporation is. The simplest way to see this is just by looking up McDonald's score and then looking up Tesla's score. Why on earth would Tesla, a company that is geared towards creating electric cars, which would supposedly have a long-term environmental benefit, why do they have a lower score than a fast food restaurant? That makes absolutely no sense.
I mean, there could be a reason for the low score.
Start with the ratings. Private ranking and rating companies track how well a company is doing on ESG. But in the absence of regulation, they're free to make up their own criteria and evaluation systems.
But given there's almost no transparency and really how this ESG score is determined, I'm going to hold the opinion that the reason is most likely some form of BS. It always is with those bigwigs trying to get one up on each other and not letting the rat race get ahead. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. How it's related to gaming, not sure. The point I am trying to make is that given all this information I gathered, the best thing I can do is speculate on why a game like Dead Space Remake would really make these little small changes within the actual story that are being pointed out as woke. And I decided to narrow it down to the three that seem to fit the facts the best. A. Using superficial elements to bait rightoids to overreact to minor things. B. A way to try to market really bad games to brainless leftoids. C. A attempt to fairly represent how culture has progressed or may change in the future. Now, C is about the only one I think is really a legitimate reason for having so-called wokeness in video games. But it's more those attempts that fail is what I would consider woke. When it succeeds, it seamlessly is not criticized by very many except for the extreme on either side. But those attempts can be failures even if they were made with the best intent. Now I can see why people might think something like Dead Space Remake, along with a couple of other remake games in this sort of craze of remaking them, would really fall in this A category. But I would like to think, as the defenders of this game argue for, that it's more in the area of C and done rather well of integrating these little woke elements, if you want to call them, seamlessly in the game that, just triggers certain people. Because frankly, I don't think B even applies here. Even if you think the original Dead Space is a better game, better design, all that stuff, it's rather hard to argue, at least without the culture war wokeness argument, that the Dead Space remake is much worse than the actual original game. There are different game design choices made compared to the two, but neither one really stands out too significantly that I have seen. And that's a perfectly fine opinion to have. But when you try to say others are lying about their opinions or analysis of the game because they have a different opinion of that game than you do, that's really what I have a problem with. That's why I think gamers should discuss actual games more among themselves to, perhaps clear up any misunderstandings we have about each other's views on the media that we really should be actually caring about, instead of fighting over the stupid stuff in culture that we really can't affect at all. Unless we buy stock or build a company, all we got is our voice, opinions, and the few who build our channel, our voices. With that said, I'm done.